let's talk about voting and elections. So first we are going to talk at length about why voter turnout is low in Texas. Then we will describe the types of Texas elections. We'll understand how elections are administered in Texas. And finally, we'll talk about the factors that give an advantage or give a disadvantage to candidates in Texas elections. So let's first explore one of the vocabulary words of the text, and that is just this idea that they call the participation paradox. If one person's vote is not going to make that much of a difference, why do people vote? Why do people make the effort to come out and vote? Well, there are a few things that determine why people vote. And they are these three: level of education, level of income, and age. Bottom line, the higher your level of education, the more likely you are to vote. Why is that? Oh, several things you can probably think of, but I'll give you my couple. You are more likely to understand the issues, more likely to be involved in the issues, and more likely to understand how who gets in office affects you personally. Income, you have a bigger stake. If things don't go right and if the right people aren't in office, you have more to lose. And then bottom line, the older people are, up until the age where people are less and less likely to be able to get out, so late 80s, 90s. But generally, the older people are, the more likely they are to vote. There are lots of reasons that younger people don't vote. And over the years, I have had students write this on the board for me. And some of the things that they have come up with are that young people are busy. They don't feel like the issues that are going on really affect them. They don't feel like anyone is listening to them. They have lower levels of education because they're working on their education at the time. They're more likely to be moving around and so have residency issues. They literally don't care. They just have other things on their mind. Um, Although there are a lot of young people that have children, and so they are at home, especially right now. They're at home with those kids, and it's not like you can. I mean, you can, but it's not like you are likely to put on your list going to vote when you have little ones around your ankle. In Texas, in general, those are some of the issues. In Texas, we don't have much voting on the weekend. Actual voting day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And that is usually a time when people are at work. But you can always vote early, and usually early voting allows you to vote on weekends. Just putting in that plug. All right, let's talk about who can vote. Generally, if you are over 18 and you are a citizen, that is a requirement, and you are not currently under supervision, so for a felony, so actually in jail on parole or on probation for a felony, the moment that you complete your obligation, you are then free to go and register to vote. If you have not been adjudicated, mentally incompetent, and when I say adjudicated, that means you have an order from a judge saying that you are not mentally competent to make decisions for yourselves to vote. This is very, very, very rare, and it would come from a probate judge, but it would either be because you had a guardian because of mental capacity, or because you had a diagnosis of a mental illness that was of the severity and of the nature that makes you unable to make decisions. But the judge has to actually put those words in there. It is very, very rare. In Texas, we have gone rounds and rounds and rounds about this, because when Texas was added to the Voters' Rights Act in 1975, because the percentage of Hispanics was so low, that were actually turning out to vote was so low, Texas was under voting rights restrictions. Since then, Texas has always had this tradition of issues with making it easy to vote. So in 2011, Texas originally passed the voter ID law, and they firmly said that it was to prevent voter fraud. If I am not mistaken, there have been a total of 11 prosecutions in the state and 2 convictions for voter fraud. But this is a huge problem in a state with 36 million people. I'm going to leave it alone. This is the voter ID law. The voter ID law says that you have to show an ID, a photo ID, and this is the list that is acceptable: your driver's license, a state ID, an election identification certificate, which you can go to DPS and wait in line and get, but it is free, a concealed handgun license, military identification card that has your photo on it, a green card, a citizenship certificate, or a passport. Notice that, like, a school ID is not on there, a work ID is not on there. The only one of those that you don't have to actually pay money for is the election ID certificate. But you have to drive to DPS and wait in line to get the certificate. And very few people know that it is available. So Texas has been sued many times. When we were under Voting Rights Act restriction, they wouldn't let Texas enforce it. In 2012, they were not able to enforce it. After the Shelby County versus Holder case in 2015, Texas reinstated it. Then they got sued by LULAC, NAACP, and MALDEF. LULAC is League of United Latin American Citizens. MALDEF is Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They were sued, and I believe that Mark Vesey, who is the current United States representative, was in on that suit. That case goes up, gets remanded, goes up, gets remanded. They just went around in circles. Finally, Texas passed a new law in the last legislative session. In 2019, they said, okay, you can vote without one of these IDs, but you are going to have to fill out an affidavit explaining why you were unable to obtain one of these. And then you can show like a utility bill, a work ID or something like that. And if they find out that you were not truthful in your affidavit, then you can be convicted of fraud for lying basically under oath in an affidavit. So that's where we are right now in Texas. Easiest the last few times that I have voted, they have not asked me for my voter registration card. They used to have to show both, and then they would disqualify you if something didn't match on the voter registration card and the ID. Now, every time that I have gone to vote, they have just asked me for my ID. And if I had that, they would run it through a scanner. They would give me my voter card that corresponded with where I lived, because I always vote early and I never vote in my precinct. So, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. There has been enough evidence on record of legislators in Texas trying to find some way to reduce Hispanic vote. And if we are looking at pure numbers, there is a trade-off between African Americans and Caucasians between who has the highest voting rate. Certainly in 2008 and 2012, African Americans actually had a higher voting rate, but African Americans are only 13% of the population in Texas. So, and then there's a race to the bottom between Hispanics and Asian American Texans for who is going to have the lowest voting rate. So, you sometimes hear people just make a blanket statement that minorities have low voting rates. That is very high level and not really looking at the true details of voting rates in the state. So this is just looking at presidential election years and looking at voting rates in the United States. So this is not Texas specific. Oh, here I go. This is not Texas specific, but this is in the United States. So notice that there were big dips like in 1948. I think that was Truman and Dewey, if I'm not mistaken. Highest voting rate was between 60 and was in 1960. That was between Kennedy and Nixon. Had a really big dip in 1988. Another dip in 96. This is really basically the trend. If it is a boring election, or people don't like either of the two major candidates, then voter turnout is low. And that was certainly true in 48 with Truman and Dewey. People did not care for Harry Truman, and Dewey just did not spark the imagination. 1988, that was when I was a senior in high school. That was the first time that I voted. And that was, oh, was that Bush and Mondale? Bush and the caucus, maybe? Maybe it was Bush and the caucus. And people just were not super excited about either of the candidates. In 1996, Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, by this time, Democrats were so mad at Bill Clinton. Oh my gosh, they were so mad. This was right in the middle of the Lewinsky scandal, and impeachment talks, and so Democrats were really upset. I was super upset at Bill Clinton, and it just depressed voter turnout. Notice that there was a high, not nearly 1964 level, but there was a big rise in 2008. There was a dip in 2012, a slight rise in 2016, and 2018. Well, we'll just keep going. We'll keep going. If we compare the United States to other countries, there are some countries that have really high voting rates. I don't know what they're doing in Uruguay. I have no idea. I know, did they take Australia off? Australia, oh, that's Austria. Australia has 79%, and Australia actually has a day off. They have a national voting day, and it is a holiday, and all you have to do that day is vote. So I don't see how the voting rate is 79%. But Texas has a tendency to linger behind, except maybe Switzerland. Geez. And I think that they took Mexico off of the list. I'm not sure why. Mexico has lower voting rates than Texas. I mean, than the United States as well. So let's look at some comparison numbers, and these are presidential elections. So in between 1996 and 2016, Texas vacillated between 48th and 49th in voting rates. And if you look at that top line, that is the voting rate in the United States, and see that Texas has very consistently been less than half, and always less than the United States, and sometimes significantly less than the United States. So this is midterm years. So this is when we're not voting for a president. Oh, look at Texas's voting rates. Now 2006, we hit the distinction of being 50th. Whoop, whoop. And we held that in 2006, 2010, 2014. I have not seen the numbers for 2018, but we had record turnout in 2018. And so it is going to be very interesting to see if that was an anomaly, if that was just because people were pretty excited about Beto O'Rourke in his bid for senator against Ted Cruz, or if that is a new trend for the state of Texas. So we will have to wait till 2022 to see whether or not that was the beginning of a trend, or if that was just because of the candidates. So if we have not gotten anything else so far, I hope that you have in your mind that voter turnout in Texas is low. So we have several theories that have been put forth about why Texas in particular has low voter turnout. So we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about legal constraints. We'll talk about demographic factors. We'll talk about political structure, party competition, and political culture. So let's start with legal constraints. So this is the theory. The theory is that Texas over time has had legal constraints on voting that have sent the message to several people that we don't want you to vote. And so families have not developed a tradition of voting because there were so many barriers in the past to their families. So we'll start with poll tax. In the Texas Constitution, 1902, Texas adopted poll tax. Now, the cost was $1.75. That was $150 plus 25 optional for the county. And when we have gone and adjusted, that's about $35, which had to be paid at the beginning of each year um, to vote in November. A lot of times people did not have it. And so it really kept poor Texans from voting. Now, there was an assumption that African Americans were going to be the most likely to not have the money. So it was aimed at, in Texas, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, it was aimed at African Americans, but it ended up affecting people of all races because there were a lot of people that did not have that money at the beginning of the year to spare to register to vote. It really wasn't until 1966 there was the case of United States versus Texas. Y'all know I love cases. When when Texas was fully told you can't charge poll tax for anything. The 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964, and so it voided poll tax in national elections, but Texas kept charging poll tax for local and state elections. And finally, the United States government, they were sued, and the United States government told them, you can't do that. Women were not able to vote in the United States until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was finally ratified. Remember that women in Texas were able to vote in primaries starting in 1918 due to the Texas suffragette movement led by, among other people, Minnie Fisher Cunningham. So women were able to vote, white women were able to vote starting in 1918, and then the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, or ratified in 1920, and so women got the right to vote. In Texas, for years, Texas had a rule that only whites could vote in primaries. Now, a primary election is when you decide who is going to be the nominee from your party. And for years, things were very one-sided. After E.J. Davis got out of office, good heavens, we weren't going to have a Republican in Texas. We didn't have a Republican governor for 100 years after E.J. Davis left. So, I mean, Democratic Party, basically, the primary was where you determined who was actually going to get the office. And so Texas had a law that said that only whites, and it said it explicitly, could vote in primaries. And then they were sued. The case was Nixon versus Herndon, if I'm not mistaken. And so, and they said, this is a violation of the 14th Amendment. You can't have distinctions based on race. So Texas said, okay, that's fine. The Democratic Party said, well, we're not a governmental entity, so we're going to just say that Democratic primaries are whites only. And they did that until the suit Smith versus Allwright. One of those was the Secretary of State. And that case was decided by the Supreme Court in 1944. Smith versus Allwright. And we talked about Smith versus Allwright in chapter 1 as well. So they said no more white primaries. Another thing that Texas used to do, and this was also very common across the South, was require you to live in the state for a whole year and 6 months in the county. So if you were a migrant worker, um, you were out of luck. Um, and so this really hindered a lot of people, especially if they worked in agriculture or did any job where you had to move around, like picking cotton or agriculture in some of the more temperate areas in the state. It was really not until 1972 that that Texas was sued, um, and in Dunn versus Bloomstein, they finally said, "Yeah, you're not gonna be able to have those long residency requirements anymore." And so Texas had to get rid of that. The only real residency requirement in Texas now is 30 days. You have to register 30 days prior to the election that you vote in. Texas used to have a requirement that you be a property owner to vote in some elections. There were several cases that were filed, and finally, the Supreme Court said, "Yeah, you cannot do that. You cannot tie the ability to vote to owning property." And so, but I mean, Texas did it, and Texas tried it. Texas used to have a requirement that you register every year, annual registration. So it I mean, just think about that. That is onerous. Not only were you having to go and register every year, you were also having to pay poll taxes up until 1971. They had annual registration. And they used to require not 30 days, but that you had to register by January 31st. And a lot of people would miss that. Now, I'm not sure what was going on. Oh, it was the same case, that Bear versus Smith. But I'm not sure what was going on in 1971 and 1972, but there was a lot of hubbub around voting in the early 70s. Number 9. And I think this is dirty. Texas used to, years ago, go through the people that had registered to vote, and that was the people that they would call for jury duty. It was designed to keep people from registering to vote, because people were like, I don't want to serve on a jury, so I'm not going to register to vote, because that's who they pick from. Texas does not do this anymore, but you will find people, especially older Texans, that believe that if they register to vote, they're going to be more likely to be called for jury duty. Now Texas uses driver's licenses for the jury list. So that really opens up the pool, and it does not matter if you're registered to vote at all. They are not tied anymore, but they have been. And remember when we were talking about voter levels, and we were saying that people with higher income are more likely to vote. Well, Texas has 4 million people that live in poverty. And so with that high a poverty rate, and given that income and level education are such important determinants in participating, having that high poverty rate affects our voter turnout. And remember back from chapter 1 when we were talking about traditionalistic and individualistic political cultures? Traditionalistic is one where they are going to be discouraging new people from voting because they want to keep things the way they were. Individualistic is, I really don't care about you. If this doesn't affect me, then I'm just going to, I'm going to stay over here. So that combination of really trying to keep you from voting or really not caring because it doesn't affect me also affects voter turnout. So in general, participation in politics is not as highly regarded in the state of Texas as it is in some other states. Now, there has been some evidence that some elections in Texas are just not highly competitive. Up until the late 80s, Democrats were winning everything. Democrats were winning everything in Texas. And so it wasn't, I mean, like, you would every now and then have an anomaly, a blip, and a Republican would get elected to something. But for the most part, elections were just not competitive. And remember, when we were looking at the United States trend, when elections are not competitive, people are much less likely to turn up and vote. Now, baby, I'm not from New Orleans, but I think that this merits a baby. This is a highly competitive race coming up in 2020. And I just don't know. I just don't know. We may buck all the trends in Texas. We may see high voter turnout. We may somehow be higher than 48th or 49th. We, for the last 20 or so years, 20, 30 years, we have had very uncompetitive races, and so the Republicans were more likely to win since the 90s. Republicans are much more likely to win. So we just have not seen a lot of competitive races. So I think even looking at that list that we looked at before, I really think the fact that we have not had competitive races is probably one of the biggest factors in our low voter turnout. But we will see. We will see. Put a pin in that and let's talk again in December. So there's other ways to participate in voting, participate in politics, signing petitions, attending rallies, and still Texas, in comparison, Texas is much less likely to vote, and they're much less likely to participate in other forms of political participation too. But in the United States in general, people are more likely to take part in political participation in other ways. Boy, have we not seen that in 2020.